You have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are. Faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are. Faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
I wonder when Saul was a little boy, if he could have ever imagined the great adventure that he would have. He grew up believing in God and then developed into a fine young man as a Pharisee who was a lover of the law and was serious about his faith in God. In Acts chapter 25, as we continue our study in this wonderful book, we see how Paul's life has continued to advance along this journey, this path that God had planned for him. For as he is in his prime, if you will, this young developing Pharisee, he heard about this sect, this group that had turned away from truth and were following some false Messiah named Jesus of Nazareth. He made it his mission and his life's purpose to destroy this opposition to all that God would call near and dear to his heart. But on the road to Damascus, he saw a bright light and heard the voice and had a meeting with Jesus. The very one that he intended to stamp out, at least the memory of his name, this man who had died on the cross, this one was alive and well and sovereign and changed his life. Since then, Paul has, with great fervor and conviction, followed Jesus and represented him. He's been faithful to share the story of Jesus, who he is and what he's done and what is coming, every opportunity that he can. After this mistrial with Governor Festus, where after 2 years of waiting, Festus showed his true colors so rapidly that he is really about trying to do a political favor for the Jewish leadership than doing what's right. When Paul sees that, he makes his appeal to Caesar. And then that moves things in an entirely different direction. He will now stand before the imperial courts of Nero in Rome. In chapter 23, verse 11, God had told him to take courage, to not be afraid, that he would be his witness in Rome just as he was in Jerusalem. Perhaps in the language there, it does have a legal ring to it, that perhaps even then Paul got a hint that it would be in this long, drawn-out legal process that he would go to Rome. But it has certainly become clear to him by verse 12. So he makes his appeal to Caesar. He has done nothing wrong, nothing worthy of death, and that Festus should do what is right, that is, acquit him, because there have been no charges whatsoever. No Roman charges have been leveled or levied against Paul. Oh, there's been what Festus will call the terms of religious debate and dissension and disagreement between Paul and other Jews. But what does that have to do with a Roman court? It's a simple case, but Festus, being the politician, tried to curry favor rather than do what is right. So he appealed to Caesar in verse 11. As he told Festus in verse 11, if I then am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. Because now Festus is asking, well, would you like to go to Jerusalem that I might hear the case in Jerusalem? What difference does the location make? They've made their charges. They have brought those accusations in verse 7. So why does the location change from Caesarea to Jerusalem make any difference at all? And so Paul makes his appeal. Festus is in a bind in verse 12. He appeals with his counselors, and he grants the right of appeal. But he's got to send a prisoner to the imperial court. Could you imagine going to traffic court today and having a disagreement with the process and then making an appeal directly to the Supreme Court? Suppose that appeal was granted and you packed your things and you traveled and you stood before the Supreme Court as the defendant. Well, the judges in that tremendous and mighty setting would be asking the prosecutor or whoever the plaintiff is, what charges is it that's brought against this man? And suppose they said, we don't have any, or we don't know, or let me get back to you. Could you imagine the Supreme Court's reaction? What are you doing standing here with no accusation? And that's exactly the fix that Festus has found himself in. He has granted an appeal to Caesar with absolutely no accusation. Nothing against Roman law can be recorded and sent along with Paul. And so now in verse 13, now when several days had elapsed, so Festus has time to consider this. He's granted an appeal, but there has to be some supporting document, some background, some explanation as to, one, what the charge is, but two, why he couldn't resolve it in the proper jurisdiction, why an appeal was needed. He has no information for any of those points. So after several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. It's what dignitaries do when a new dignitary comes to town. The other indignant dignitaries come and make nice and rub elbows, and it's a gala, and it's time for fancy clothes and fancy foods, and it's just hobnobbing with those that are large and in charge. King Agrippa is an interesting representative in this case. He was actually raised in Rome. He's the last of the Herodian line, and having been raised in Rome, he had been trained as a Jew, but not as a native, and he has Caesar's pleasure, who would want to send him to rule in this region. Now, his kingdom, if you will, or his jurisdiction, he will be put in charge of the temple and all things relating to the temple. He's not in charge of the geography. He's not in charge of the nation, but you might say he's in charge of the nation's religion and culture, which is significant. So as one who is in charge of the temple, it'll also be up to King Agrippa to choose the high priests. And so while there's not a lot of necessarily economic or geographical power, there's much political power in this position. So when he comes along with Bernice, now Bernice is his sister. Originally, she married her uncle, but when he passes, she moves in with her brother. They have, or when their incestuous relationship becomes public, she'll temporarily marry someone else to try to cover her tracks, but she'll end up moving back in with her brother, King Agrippa. And so the brother and sister / husband and wife will come to visit Festus in Caesarea. Verse 14, while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king. Well, one, there's a potential advantage because of Agrippa's background. They have Rome in common. Both Festus and Agrippa have arrived originally in Caesarea from Rome. However, King Agrippa has the training as a Jew, and because he's involved with the temple, and if he can choose the high priest, then he ought to be able to help Festus maneuver through this situation that's got the high priests and some of the Sanhedrin all stirred up. Secondly, Festus is probably in a little bit of a panic, or at least he knows he's in a bind, because he has allowed an appeal for which he has no standing. So it wouldn't hurt to either gain more information or maybe get somebody else's name on the document as well. Because again, Agrippa has great, or strong at least, connections in Rome. So he lays the case before the king, and he says, there is a man who is left as a prisoner by Felix. Festus, boy, he's quite the politician. So he begins by saying, this is Felix's fault, or this is a mess I inherited. I came and here's this situation, which is true, but he certainly could have solved it earlier. This man was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests, these are the ones that Felix, or rather Agrippa, has installed. And when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. Festus sure paints with a sweet brush, doesn't he? It's not my fault. I got to town, I inherited this mess, and the chief priest had this kind of unusual request, but, I'm a Roman, and I am nothing if not faithful to Rome and to all things Roman, and so I told them this is how the courts have to go. Well, again, mostly yes, at least how it began. He did not agree to their original request of bringing Paul to Jerusalem, but rather he invited them to Caesarea, as we saw earlier in the chapter. Verse 17, so after they had assembled here, I did not delay, because, he's a stickler for doing what's right and just. I did not delay, but on the next day I took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accuser stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting. Well, another fair point. There's some, I guess, I'll just say politician, I guess. What he's saying is grounded in, related to truth, and it certainly is how things have gone, but he's only talking in terms of the letter of what's been done, not the spirit. He hasn't talked about his own desire, about how he wants to please the Jews, about how this is about trying to curry favor. He doesn't get into that. He keeps it very black and white, very clear and very clean. So the charges that they brought were not what is expecting, because since he's a Roman governor and they're in a Roman court, and this is a trial of a Roman citizen, then there should have been reference to Roman law. What Roman laws were broken? And what is the evidence that Paul has broken Roman laws so that a sentence of condemnation could be carried out? None of those things happened. Not only were they not references to Roman laws broken, they were references to Jewish laws broken, which has no bearing, means nothing in a Roman court of law. Secondly, even those accusations against the Jewish law, because maybe they could have at least painted how Paul was such a bad guy, they didn't have evidence. They couldn't even prove those accusations. They really, literally had a bag of nothing that they have presented against Paul. Verse 19, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion. And here's where Festus can play that, I don't really, I don't get all this, but Agrippa, man, this is your wheelhouse. This is right in your breadbasket. You know this kind of stuff, so you got to help me out here. Had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Well, that's a headliner. That's fascinating. That has nothing to do, again, with Roman law. Whether Jesus is alive or not alive has nothing to do with the Roman court. It might sound crazy. It might be amazing. It could be incredible, but it has nothing to do with any legal matters, and not even anything to do with Jewish law in terms of some kind of violation. So, verse 20, being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. Now here's where he really starts smudging things and fudging things. Now he's trying to explain, again, giving the background for how the appeal process came about without admitting his own failings or guilt in any way. Even if Agrippa is listening closely, moving the trial to Jerusalem doesn't do anything for jurisdiction or standing in Roman law, unless the implication is that he offered Paul to be tried by the Jews, let's say the Sanhedrin, in Jerusalem to advocate or to hand over the case out of the Roman system back into the Jewish system. He doesn't say to be tried by me or tried by them. So you could kind of read it either way, and it may be that Festus words it that way on purpose, leaves it ambiguous. He didn't say to stand before me in Jerusalem. Go back up to verse 9. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these things?" So it's very clear to Paul, well, it's still going to be up to me, but how about we go to Jerusalem, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's when Paul realizes this isn't going anywhere. I appeal to Caesar. But in talking to Festus, he doesn't add that part, to stand trial before me, just to go to trial there, or to be heard or have that case heard in Jerusalem. Verse 21, but when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I could send him to Caesar. So none of this is Festus's fault, right? He inherited this from Felix, and he's just trying to sort this out. And to his surprise, it's a really complicated Jewish religious matter for which he has no training and, honestly, no real authority. And then, secondly, and so, I'm trying to help. I offered him, well, why don't we have the trial in Jerusalem, because this is a Jewish issue. And then Paul, out of nowhere, appeals to Caesar. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, Paul didn't ask to stay in custody. Paul didn't ask to stay under house arrest. What Paul said is, look, if I've done something worthy of death, then let's get it done. But if not, then I should be acquitted. And if not, there shouldn't be any charges. I have done nothing wrong, as you very well know, into verse 10. So this is not what Paul said. Paul does not desire to continue in custody. He makes the appeal because Festus forced it upon him by revealing he would not pursue what is right. In Paul's mind is still the 2-year-old fresh memory of an attempted assassination plot that was supposed to happen while he was traveling, and Lysias moved him by night under heavy guard to Caesarea and thus foiled the plot. So Paul realizes that he's at risk out on the open road. And Festus plays right into that possibility. So Festus lays out his problem. I inherited this really strange, weird, complicated thing, and it's all about Jewish law and Jewish religion, and I'm certainly no expert, certainly not like you. And anyway, he appealed to Caesar, so wow, what are you going to do? So, verse 22, then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. And he says so. This is worded in a way of respect. Agrippa's not making any demands. He has no authority over Festus. Quite the reverse. So it's an interest and seems to be somewhat genuine. Now, there's a couple of things in play here. One, when Festus says, Paul's talking about this dead guy Jesus that Paul claims alive. Well, Agrippa had to have heard about this, as Paul will say this was not done in a corner in chapter 26. So Agrippa's familiar with at least the rumors, if nothing else. So what an interesting way to find out more. 2, it is an odd claim. What does this have to do with this Jewish religion, and why are the chief priests wrapped around the axle with this? What's going on? So I could see some genuine curiosity, but don't forget that Agrippa and Bernice have come down to pay their respects to Festus. And they stayed there many days, verse 14, which suggests it's gone well. They've gone past just all right, babe, here's what we got to do. Let's get in there, let's make nice, and let's get out. All right? You may or may not have been in some social settings where you're on a tight timeline, had to go, make the rounds, and gone. Well, these folks stay for a while, and that means it seems to have gone well, and that they've cultivated some kind of beginning relationship, enough that Festus says, maybe you can help me out. So 1, Agrippa may very well have a curiosity about knowing more about Paul's story. But 2, if King Agrippa can solve this problem for Festus, because Festus has said, I'm in a bind, he's appealed to Caesar, I don't know what to do about all this. And so if Agrippa can help Festus, it'd be nice to do Festus a favor and have him owe him one. Would be kind of a nice thing. And so that certainly is on Agrippa's mind, I would think. So Festus says, tomorrow you shall hear him, because he's already stalled a few days and some time while Agrippa was there. So the clock's ticking on this appeal, because not only is he going to have to explain why he sent him, but if there's any kind of significant gap or waiting period, he's going to have to explain what took so long. Because already there's this problem of, so this goes back more than 2 years. So Felix kept Paul a prisoner, under house arrest, but still a prisoner. And the Roman commander brought him from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Felix kept him 2 years, and we still don't have any charges. We still don't have anything we can say. And so there's a lot of explaining already. So Festus says tomorrow. He's in a hurry, I think, to get to a solution. Verse 23, so on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp, what an understatement. They would have had all their robes on and their bling and their hair done. This is a big court scene. They arrive amid great pomp, so there might have even been music or trumpets or announcements. And they entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders. These are the chiliarchs like Lysias. These are guys that are each in charge of 1,000 troops. There would have been 5 in Caesarea. So these are the highest military officers in the region. So you've got this auditorium where you have a king and his wife/sister. You have a king that's in attendance. You have the 5 greatest military leaders in full regalia that are going to be there, as well as the governor himself will be there in his finest. But we also read they're accompanied by, Agrippa and Bernice are accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city. From this phrase, it's an unusual Greek phrase, the prominent men, the French translation, par excellence, this comes from these prominent men, these excellent ones. It's a unique expression that is stuck around in some other languages. Flip back to chapter 9. I was talking about how Saul might have grown up and what dreams he might have had about his future. In chapter 9 of Acts, when Paul has been struck blind and has spent 3 days praying and fasting, the Lord sends Ananias to him in verse 10. And Ananias balks at that in verse 13 and says, I've heard how much harm this man has done to your saints, and he has authority to bind all who call on your name. In verse 15, but the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. I'll show him how much he must suffer for my sake. And here he is among the Gentiles and before kings. What a scene. The auditorium would have been appropriately gilded. It would have been appropriately dolled up, dressed up, formal. And they show up in their finest regalia, much pomp. Everybody's wearing their best. These are all of the important people. They're large in charge. And at the command of Festus, the governor who sits in his rightful place, Luke simply says Paul was brought in. Now, Paul is probably not dressed in rags. He's not confined to a cell. He's under house arrest. And then back in chapter 24, verse 23, we read, then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. So I would assume over the 2 years that would include making sure that Paul has appropriate clothing that is in good form, that's clean, all that sort of thing. But, so Paul would have had on clean clothes, nice clothes, but they would have been common clothes, a simple tunic and a sash. It would have been the normal kinds of things that he would have wore. I would suspect he blended right in with the average middle class or so in the marketplace, just a normal outfit. in a room that's glittering, in a room that all the women are wearing jewelry loaded down with precious metals and stones, and the men are wearing all their medals and their ribbons and their coats, and they have their gleaming swords and all the glitter and all the bling that's possible. The room would have sparkled with the people in attendance, and then you'd have the servants by the doors, the criers at the entrances, and people there waiting on the prominent folks with whatever needs they might have. And then in walks Paul, dressed in an ordinary and common way. But for all of their clothes and all their bling and all their glitter, the Apostle Paul is going to stand there with such power and such conviction. In mere moments, he will be the largest person in the room. He will be the most influential. He will be the one that will cause the room to collectively gasp, to draw breath, to cause the room to be as quiet as you can imagine. Paul was brought in. Verse 24, Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, another stretch, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. That would have been an interesting thing to hear for those who may not have been familiar with all the details of the case, that this is a capital situation, or it is a potential capital crime. That is, that what the Jews want is for him to be executed. He's not worthy to live. They want Paul's life taken in payment for the wrongs that he's done. So instantly, this is the most serious case. This isn't a misdemeanor. This isn't a crashing the camel into your neighbor's fence. This is absolute top priority, highest felony charge. It is a capital case, a life and death matter. So Festus begins with drama and flair. Everybody's not only brought to attention, but he's paying great respect to King Agrippa. That this is what he's brought to King Agrippa is not some misdemeanor loaf of bread stolen in the street, that he has brought this most serious case to the wise and benevolent King Agrippa. Festus really needs a favor, and likely Agrippa is really eager to give him a favor. And so he sets the stage for the seriousness of the charge. Verse 25, but I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. Okay, well then I don't know why we're here. Case dismissed. That should have been done way back earlier in the chapter. So why are we here? Well, glad you asked, Festus might say. I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. He himself decided, did he? Well, it's true. Festus didn't have his hand up Paul's back and was speaking and using him like a sock puppet. I want to go to Caesar. No, it's true. Paul decided that, but only because Festus had caused it, had forced it, had not given Paul any other option. Turn, if you would, to the last chapter of Acts, chapter 28. Listen to how Paul says it. Well, let's see. So chapter 28, verse 17, where Paul is telling the leading men of the Jews, they come together. He began to say to them, Brethren, though I have done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. And when they had examined me, they were willing to release me because there was no ground for putting me to death. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar, not that I had any accusation against my nation. So Paul rightly says he was forced to. He wasn't given a choice by the political maneuvering and foolishness of Festus. Folks keep making the same mistake. When they think about Paul as a prisoner, they think, he's some strange fellow that's following this weird offshoot thing, and anyway, let's just get this put to rest. And they're not taking the time to get to know Paul or to listen to Paul. Lysias made that big mistake when he rescued him and thought at first he was an Egyptian, maybe an assassin, and then finds out he's Hebrew. Felix makes the same mistake and is startled by the power of the words that Paul speaks. Festus makes the same mistake in chapter 25 when he has a Jew standing around him and making all these accusations, and he's offering Paul, let's go to Jerusalem, that he didn't expect Paul to lay out this appeal to Caesar. Lysias, way back, was about to put him in chains and was about to scourge him when Paul says, you're going to do this to a Roman citizen? And that creates all the stir that's led us to here. So over and over and over, these folks that are in authority who have to make decisions aren't doing any research. And the same is going to be true for not only Festus, but Agrippa in the very next chapter. So he says, I decided to send him because, he's just so kind and benevolent. Well, they got forced into it. Verse 26, yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. That's why we're having this scene. Because he's laid out the case. Look, I didn't find anything wrong with him, but he still wants to go to Caesar, and I don't know why. And I've got to write something to go with him, so I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. He gives Agrippa the opportunity to do him a big favor. And Agrippa can maneuver because he's the king of the Jews. He's supposed to be the expert. Surely, though he was raised in Rome, surely he's the perfect fellow to have enough Jewish background and yet have the Roman loyalty that he can glean out of all this Jewish strangeness and concoct some kind of solid Roman reason for why Paul has to go to Rome. That's what Festus is kind of set up for King Agrippa, and that would be the big favor. And again, I would suspect that Agrippa's highly motivated to come through, highly motivated to deliver this favor to get Festus out of a bind. It would sure go well for him. But Agrippa doesn't know Paul, and Agrippa's going to have an eye-opening experience in the very next chapter. Festus concludes when he says, for it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner, not to indicate also the charges against him. He's right. It is absurd, but it won't just be absurd to him. It's going to be absurd to Caesar, whom Festus serves. So he also plays his card here. He tips his hand. He allows Agrippa to get some insight into what kind of bind Festus is in. He's got himself stuck. He inherited a strange case to him. He's made it worse. He did a very poor job of this, and now it's moved out of his hands, although it'll drag his name down with it. He's himself going to be in trouble with Rome if he can't figure this out. So Agrippa is going to give Paul the opportunity to speak. So Festus has kind of set Agrippa up as an examiner, a judge, but isn't exactly what Agrippa's going to do. What he'll do in the very next verse is, okay, Paul, tell us your story. So he doesn't have the questions. He doesn't really have a good grip on the case. He won't ask cross-examination questions. In fact, Agrippa is going to experience conviction and power through Paul from the Holy Spirit. He will have an eye-opening experience in the very next chapter.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive.